James Miller gave everything to his country, only to be mocked and cast aside in the workplace he trusted most. His boss, Thomas Reynolds, turned cruelty into a daily routine, stripping James of dignity with every smirk and insult. But when the truth finally reached the courtroom, a single testimony turned the tide. And just wait until you hear how this battle ended, and why justice at last rose above betrayal. James Miller had built his life on routines. After serving overseas, he returned to Texas, determined to keep his world steady and predictable. He opened the workshop doors every morning at 7, wiped the dust off the counters, and welcomed the smell of machine oil and steel. For him, fixing engines was more than a job. It was a way to bring order to a world that once had none. Neighbors knew James as the kind man who would repair a lawnmower for free or change a flat tire without taking a cent. He rarely talked about his past, and when people asked, he brushed it off with a half smile and said, "That was another life." What he never admitted out loud was that the nights were different. The silence brought restless dreams, and sudden noises sometimes made his heart race. But by day, he wore the mask of calm. Everything changed when Thomas Reynolds became the new supervisor at the shop. Reynolds was sharp-dressed, confident, and carried himself like someone who thrived on control. The first week, things seemed ordinary. New rules, new schedules, new routines. But soon, he discovered James's medical history. What should have remained private became a weapon in Reynolds's hands. It started small. While walking past the workbench, Reynolds smirked and said, "Careful with those tools, soldier. Don't lose your cool." The words were delivered with a laugh, as if it were just a joke. James tried to shrug it off the way he had done so many times before in life. But the comments didn't stop. Each day they grew sharper, louder, harder to ignore. "Don't snap on me, old man. Keep your head straight. We don't want an incident." The others in the shop chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or stay quiet. Most stayed silent. Silence, James realized, was its own form of betrayal. Reynolds began assigning James the dirtiest jobs, the late shifts no one wanted, the endless overtime. When James asked why, Reynolds replied with a thin smile, "Someone as tough as you can handle it, right?" It wasn't a compliment. It was a way of pushing him to the edge, daring him to break. James had faced pressure before. He had endured far worse than a man in a tie barking insults. But there was something different about this. Reynolds wasn't just mocking him as a worker. He was mocking the years James had given, the struggles he carried, the sacrifices he could never erase. The moment that changed everything came one humid afternoon. The shop was hot, the fans barely spinning, and James was tightening bolts on an engine block when Reynolds' voice cut through the clatter of tools. "Watch yourself, psycho," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. For a moment, the entire room went still. Wrenches stopped clinking. Air seemed heavier. James didn't lift his head, but inside, something flared. It wasn't simple hurt. It wasn't embarrassment. It was anger. Deep, raw, righteous anger. Anger that all the miles, all the sacrifices, all the sleepless nights had been reduced to a punchline. Anger that a man who had never carried his burdens could so casually turn them into a joke. James clenched the wrench in his hand and took a breath. He didn't lash out. He didn't shout back. But inside, the fire had started, and once lit, it would not be easy to put out. The humiliation didn't stop after that day. It grew roots. For months, James endured the same sharp words, the same smirks, the same pointed glances that told him he didn't belong. Coworkers who once shared coffee with him now kept their distance. They weren't cruel. They were afraid of losing their jobs, afraid of drawing Reynolds' attention. Silence became their shield, but to James, it felt like abandonment. Being cast aside was nothing new. He had felt it years earlier, stepping off the plane after his service, greeted not with gratitude, but with a kind of wary distance. Now, decades later, the same shadow followed him. It wasn't just Reynolds' words that stung. It was the quiet agreement of those who said nothing. Nights became the hardest. James would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the tick of the clock, waiting for sleep that never came. When he did drift off, his rest was fragile, shattered by sudden jolts awake. He would sit up, chest pounding, wiping sweat from his face as if the room itself had betrayed him. Daylight should have been a relief, but instead it brought a different kind of torment. The shop smelled of oil and gasoline, scents he once loved because they reminded him of honest work. But now, those same smells blended with memories he wished he could bury. Heat, smoke, confusion, the roar of machines that were not meant to be fixed, but feared. The past had a way of seeping into the present, sneaking in through the smallest cracks. Every time Reynolds raised his voice, James felt it in his bones. The sharp tone cut through him like an echo from another life. Colleagues might have heard only a boss giving orders, but James heard something else. Shouts that pulled him back to places he tried to forget. His mind raced faster than his body could keep up, and he struggled to hold on to the present moment. He felt control slipping, slowly but unmistakably. The shop, once his sanctuary of order, became a place of unease. He moved carefully, as though each step could set something off inside him. Tools clattered louder, engines roared sharper, and laughter from across the room carried a sting. There were moments when James thought of walking away. "Maybe I should just quit," he told himself, wiping grease from his hands, staring at the floor. It seemed like the easiest way out. No confrontation, no more humiliation. But the thought lingered with a weight he couldn't shake. What would quitting mean? How could he look his wife in the eye and explain that after years of surviving, after years of holding everything together, he couldn't endure the words of one man in a clean shirt? How could he tell his children that the father they looked up to, the one who once stood unshaken, was now crumbling under ridicule? That question tore at him more than anything Reynolds ever said. The shame of failing in silence, of appearing fragile, was almost unbearable. The pain wasn't only in the insults. It was in the way they echoed every hidden fear James carried, and the more he tried to bury them, the heavier they became. Each day blurred into the next, leaving him trapped between the man he once was and the man he was afraid of becoming. The breaking point came on a sweltering afternoon. The shop floor was loud with clanging tools, fans turning lazily overhead. James was bent over an engine block when Reynolds' voice rose above the noise, sharp and deliberate. "Men like you shouldn't have been shot at," Reynolds sneered. "You should have been left behind." The words hung in the air like smoke. For a second, the entire workshop went silent. A wrench dropped in the distance, echoing like a bell. James froze, his knuckles whitening around the ratchet. The room didn't spin, but it felt heavy, as if gravity itself had doubled. He wanted to answer, but no sound came. It wasn't fear, it was exhaustion. And then something unexpected happened. Michael, the youngest mechanic in the shop, glanced up from his workstation. He couldn't have been more than 22, barely out of school, still learning the trade. For weeks he had stayed quiet, watching the tension grow. But now his face hardened. He looked at Reynolds, then at James, and back again. Finally, he shook his head as though he couldn't bear the silence any longer. Later that day, while the others filtered out, Michael approached James quietly. He kept his voice low, his eyes shifting nervously toward the office. "You don't have to take this," he whispered. "This isn't right. You can fight back. You've got rights." For James, those words struck deeper than he expected. He had grown used to standing alone. To hear someone, anyone, say he deserved better, it was like the first crack of sunlight after a long storm. That night, James sat at his kitchen table with his wife, the room lit only by the warm glow of the lamp. He repeated Michael's words, still unsure if he believed them. His wife listened quietly, her hand resting gently on his. Finally, she said, "You've fought for justice your whole life. Why stop now?" It was the kind of encouragement James didn't know he needed until he heard it. The next morning, he made a call. The name was given to him by a veterans support group, Samuel Harris, a lawyer who had served in Iraq. From the first conversation, Samuel's voice carried both calm and conviction. He didn't need explanations. He understood immediately. "This isn't just about words," Samuel said. "It's about respect. It's about making sure no one strips away the dignity you've earned." Hope began to stir. It was fragile at first, like a seed struggling through hard soil, but it was real. The process wasn't easy. There were forms to fill, testimonies to gather, long nights spent reliving moments James wished he could forget. Each step felt like walking uphill with a weight strapped to his back. But for the first time in years, he wasn't carrying that weight alone. Samuel was there, guiding him, pushing the paperwork forward. Michael agreed to testify. And at home, his wife reminded him daily why this mattered. The fear didn't vanish, but something stronger began to take its place. Determination, a belief that maybe, just maybe, he could turn years of silence into something that mattered, not just for himself, but for every man and woman who had ever been told they were less than what they truly were. And in that quiet resolve, James found something he hadn't felt in decades: hope. The courtroom was quiet, but the tension inside it was as heavy as steel. For James, it felt like the last battlefield of his life, not one fought with weapons, but with truth. He sat beside his lawyer, Samuel Harris, steadying his breath as he scanned the room. His hands, roughened from years of work, rested on the table, but his heart pounded like a drum. Across from him sat Thomas Reynolds. Crisp suit, polished shoes, the same smirk James had seen so many times in the shop. To Reynolds, this was just another day, another show of control. He leaned back in his chair as if victory were already his. The proceedings began. Samuel read witness statements with firm conviction, each word carefully placed. The air carried every syllable, bouncing off the walls of the courtroom. Still, Reynolds seemed unaffected, arms crossed, a faint grin tugging at his mouth. Then came the moment no one expected. Michael, the youngest mechanic, walked nervously to the stand. His hands trembled as he adjusted the microphone, his voice quiet at first. But as he began to speak, the room shifted. He described the daily ridicule, the assignments meant to break James down, the words that cut deeper than anyone realized. The silence was suffocating. Even the sound of papers rustling stopped. The jury leaned in closer, their eyes fixed on the young man who finally dared to speak the truth. Reynolds' smirk faltered just slightly for the first time. And then it was James's turn. He rose slowly, every step toward the stand measured, deliberate. His voice, when it came, was not loud but steady, carrying the weight of decades. "I never asked for medals," he began, his gaze fixed not on Reynolds, but on the jury. "All I ever wanted was to live honestly, to work with dignity. But when someone you once risked your life for calls you broken, that's not just an insult. That's a betrayal worse than any wound." The words lingered in the still air. Some jurors shifted uncomfortably. Others blinked quickly, as though holding back emotion. Samuel let the silence work, knowing the truth spoke louder than any argument he could craft. When the jury left to deliberate, the room buzzed with quiet whispers. Minutes felt like hours. James sat, his wife's hand resting on his, her grip strong, unshaken. Then the door opened. The foreman stood, papers in hand. The verdict was unanimous. The court ruled in James's favor. His rights had been violated, and compensation was awarded, but money was the last thing on his mind. What James felt in that moment was something he thought he had lost forever, his dignity restored. As the judge read the decision, James turned to see his wife's eyes glistening with tears. In the back rows, a small group of veterans who had come to support him rose to their feet, their applause filling the chamber with a sound that was more powerful than any gavel strike. For James, it wasn't about winning. It was about being seen, being heard, and knowing that his struggles were no longer buried in silence. As he walked out of the courthouse, the sun was bright, the air crisp. His step was firm, steady, each stride carrying a weight lifted from his shoulders. For the first time in years, he felt whole again. And his story did not end at those doors. It spread quietly among friends, families, and veterans who had hidden their own scars. To them, James's victory was more than a legal ruling. It was a reminder that even when it feels like society has turned its back, truth can break through walls and dignity can be reclaimed. James Miller had entered the courthouse as a man under siege. He left as a man renewed, carrying not only his own hope, but the hope of countless others who finally believed they too could stand and be heard.